Hello everyone, and welcome to the Game Engine programming series where we write the game engine from scratch. We spent the last two videos on creating a basic content browser to visualize the content folder for each game project. Right now we have got a couple of kinks to iron out, but considering this is a first iteration, I'd like to work a bit more on the UI functionality. This helps us to have a better idea of what this control does and how it can be used. After that, I'll do a second iteration which improves the content browser in its architecture as well as its functionality. So this is a blue video which is mainly focused on the UI design of the content browser. We can find the style and templates for all WPF controls in a file that's called aero2.normalcolor.xaml. There is also an aero.normalcolor.xaml without the 2 in the file name, but I use this one. This file is part of your Visual Studio installation and you can find it in the installation folder if you search for its name. Right now, I'd like to find the style for ListViewItems so that I can tweak it and make it fit our use case for the content browser. I'll bring it over to the user-controlled resources of the content browser view and reformat the code so it's nicer to read, as well as modify the style to use the editor colors. I'm retaining most of the default style, but I get rid of the border and the rounded corners, for example. The main difference is that our list view item has less junk in it. It's just a border that contains a grid view row presenter. Next are the control template triggers. Again, I'll keep most of these, but only change the colors and remove the unnecessary property setters. In case of mouse over background, I'd like to use the selected background color with a lower opacity to make it a bit darker than a selected item. You'll see this in action in a minute. When we have a selected item, but the control does not have the focus, the selection will have a gray background. Finally, when we hover the mouse over a selected item, its background will also become darker. We don't need the isEnable trigger for the current design, and so I'll remove it. And there it is. It already looks a lot better. Note that we can also resize the width of each column by dragging the dividers of grid view column headers. Speaking of which, let's format those next. Again, we can search for the default style and tweak it in our XAML file. It looks like a lot of code, but when we format the code and get rid of the unnecessary parts, it's not that bad. Here we'll use a darker gray background and remove the borders for each header. Once again, I'll simplify the look of the headers by removing some borders and such. We need the header gripper to resize the columns. I'll define a style for that later, but let's finish this one first. The same way as we did for ListViewItem style, we define the control template triggers next. These are just describing how the appearance of the header should change for mouse over is pressed and so on. Next, we have a couple of style triggers for different roles. A column header can have a normal, floating, or padding role. Floating role is when the header is being dragged to rearrange the columns, and the padding role is the column header which is added to the end of all columns. Now we can write a style for the gripper. The gripper is the vertical bar between column headers that lets you resize the columns by dragging them. Again, I'm going to copy it from default control styles and modify it here. Well, it's basically the same, except I changed the colors. Looking at the content browser, we see the column headers in their full glory. It would be nice to be able to sort the files here when we click on column headers. So let's add that functionality now. First, we need an event handler for click events. We can attach one using an event setter in grid view column header style. Press F12 to generate an empty method. Here we can use column tags to indicate which column needs sorting. Remember I defined these tags for each of the columns and didn't tell you why? Well, here is why. They hold the property names that we need for sorting. In order to sort the items in the list view, we need to create and add a sort description for the property we would like to sort for, as well as the sort direction. Therefore, we need to have a field that holds the sorted property's name and another one for list sort direction. By default, we sort the items using their file name in alphabetical order. When the user clicks any of the columns, we clear the current sort descriptions and add a new one using the columns tag, which contains the property name. Of course, if the property name and sort direction are the same as before, then we need to reverse the sort direction, because obviously the user clicked on a column that was already being used for sorting. We can run the editor and see that now we are able to sort the rows in the list by clicking any column header. One more thing that I noticed is that we can resize the columns and make them really narrow. And I'd like to set a minimum width for the columns. Unfortunately, setting min width property for the column header style doesn't apply to the whole column, and we can set the minimum width using a grid view column style because a grid view column doesn't have a min width or max width property. So we need to come up with another solution. We can add an event handler which is called when the header gripper is being dragged to resize the column. The header gripper is a thumb control, so we add an event handler for the thumb's drag delta event. When the event handler is called, we can get hold of the column header using the templated parent of thumb control and clamp the width of the column between any values that we prefer. As you can see, the width of the columns is now limited to the range that we specified. By the way, I'm not some kind of WPF guru who knows all this stuff by heart and dreams about templated parents or framework elements. I just take my time looking up the solutions to specific problems, either by reading the documentation or using Google. Okay, the next feature is changing folders by double-clicking an item in the list that is a folder. In this way, we can navigate up the folders tree. So let's use an event setter to attach a mouse double-click event handler for the list view items. In here, we can check if the item that was double-clicked is a directory, and if so, we can set the selected folder property of the content browser view model to the new folder. I'll refactor this part in another method because I want to reuse it for keyboard events, as we'll see in a minute. Let me make a few more folders for testing this. As I mentioned, we would like to be able to navigate using keyboard, so let's add another event handler for keyboard key down events for when the user presses enter and the selected item is a directory. In that case, again, we step up the folders tree by setting selected folder property to the new location. Now that we are up here, we also need to have a way down the tree, and for that I'd like to add a quick and dirty control that kind of looks like the one in Windows File Explorer, where you can click any folder down the hierarchy and go back to that location. To do this, I'll create a stack panel to which we add buttons for each path down the hierarchy. The buttons are separated by little arrow shapes, just like we see in the File Explorer. Here I'll define a style for all path shapes within this stack panel, which gives them the shape that we want by default. I also display a small folder icon on the left side of the stack. I don't see my changes in the designer, and I don't know why that is. Sometimes, if not often, problems will go away if you ignore them. So let's continue and write a function that will generate the stack of buttons when we change the selected folder. The method I'm writing seems a bit messy, but all it does is parse the selected path and create buttons and path shapes for the last 3 directories in the path hierarchy. I only do 3 because I don't know how wide the content browser panel is and I don't want to deal with that right now. 3 seems like a manageable number at this time. So after removing the trailing directory separator, we remove all items from the stack except one, which is the folder icon on the left side. Next, I parse the selected folder path string and take up to 3 subfolders. We stop parsing if we hit the content folder, because we want to prevent the user from navigating out of content folder. Then I add the buttons in reverse order and add them to the stack panel with the arrow shapes in between. Also note that I put the path to each subfolder in the button's data context, so that when we click the button, we exactly know what location we need to set the selected folder to. In the editor, we can see the buttons and arrows, but they don't look quite right, and also I still can't see the folder icon on the left. I see I made a typo in the XAML file in the folder icon's path. Let me step through the code here and try to find out why the buttons aren't generated correctly. Found it. This for loop condition should be I greater than or equals 0 and not I greater than 0. Now the buttons are generated correctly. Next, I'd like to change their appearance a little to make them look less buttony. I'd like to copy a button style from our control templates resource dictionary. We have a global button style that applies to all buttons in the editor, and a simple button style, but that one might be too simple. So let's take the global button style and use that for the path stack buttons. Adding this to stack panel's resources will override the one in application resources. Here, I simply change things like margin, padding, and minimum maximum width, and remove a bunch of bells and whistles that we don't need. Finally, we need to write a click event handler that actually changes the selected folder, depending on which button the user clicked. This is easily done by taking the button's data context as a string and use it for the selected folder. And now we can use the buttons and the content browser to navigate back and forth within the content folder. That's where I would like to leave it for today. Next time, I'm going to create another mode for the content browser to display the items as tiles instead of a list. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. If you join me on Patreon, you'll get access to the code on GitHub, so you don't have to type everything over from the video. Plus, there are also other nice goodies and rewards exclusive to my Patreon supporters. Please use the link in the video description to check them out. I hope to see you next time. Until then, take care and happy game engineering!